The fluorescent lights of North Canton Middle School hummed a monotonous tune, casting long, distorted shadows down the empty hallway. Mr. Johnson, a man whose hands knew the school's every creak and groan better than any textbook, wrestled with a particularly stubborn locker. Number 237. It was old, the metal warped and rusted in places, a relic from a bygone era. He grunted, applying more pressure to his screwdriver. This was supposed to be a simple repair, a jammed latch. Little did he know, this routine task would unearth a time capsule, a whispered story of love, loss, and a connection that spanned generations, all hidden behind a loose metal panel. He was just doing his job, keeping the school running, one squeaky hinge and stubborn lock at a time. He never expected to become a detective of lost memories. The screwdriver finally slipped, biting into the aged metal with a satisfying screech. Mr. Johnson winced, anticipating the familiar shower of rust flakes. He tugged at the door, but it remained stubbornly shut. He peered closer, noticing a gap between the locker's back panel and the wall. The panel itself seemed loose, almost detached. He ran a gloved hand along the edge, feeling a slight give. With a grunt of effort, he pulled the panel outwards, revealing a dark, dusty cavity. At first, he thought it was just accumulated debris, the usual collection of lost pencils and crumpled papers. But as his hand groped in the darkness, his fingers brushed against something different. It was soft, yielding, unlike anything he expected. He pulled it out slowly, carefully, his heart beating with a sudden, inexplicable anticipation. It was a purse, a small, rectangular purse, made of faded red leather, coated in a thick layer of dust that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. The clasp was tarnished, a dull silver, but it still held the purse firmly shut. Mr. Johnson stared at it, his brow furrowed. He'd found lost items before, of course, countless pens, notebooks, even the occasional lunchbox. But this felt different. This felt old. He carefully brushed some of the dust away, revealing the smooth, worn texture of the leather. A wave of curiosity, stronger than any he'd felt in years, washed over him. He had to open it. With trembling fingers, Mr. Johnson unclasped the purse. The snap, surprisingly crisp after decades of silence, echoed in the empty hallway. He slowly opened the flap, revealing a glimpse of the past. The interior was lined with a faded floral fabric, surprisingly intact. And it was full. The first item he pulled out was a set of pencils, sharpened to needle points. They were a deep, almost forest green, the wood smooth and worn with use. He could almost imagine a young hand gripping them, painstakingly completing homework or sketching in a notebook. Next came a small, pocket-sized calendar. The year printed on the cover, 1957. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. Tiny, handwritten notes marked certain dates: dance practice, movie with Sarah, study group. A snapshot of a busy teenage life. A YMCA membership card followed. The plastic was cracked and faded, but the black and white photo was surprisingly clear. A young woman, maybe 16 or 17, stared back at him with a bright, hopeful smile. Her hair was styled in the classic waves of the era. The name printed beneath the photo, Patricia Ramola. He carefully pulled out a stack of ticket stubs. Movie tickets, mostly, from the local cinema. He could almost smell the popcorn and hear the crackle of the projector. There were also a few stubs from school dances, the paper faded and creased. Then came the photographs. Small, black and white snapshots, some curled at the edges, others surprisingly pristine. Groups of teenagers, laughing and posing for the camera. Patty was in many of them, her smile always radiant. One photo showed her standing alone, leaning against a classic car, her eyes sparkling with youthful exuberance. He felt a pang of something. Sadness? Longing? He wasn't sure. Finally, he found the identification card. Hoover High School. Patricia Ramola. Sophomore. A more formal portrait, but the same bright smile. He flipped it over. An address, neatly printed. He spent several minutes carefully examining each item, handling them with a reverence usually reserved for museum artifacts. Each object whispered a story, a fragment of a life lived long ago. He felt a profound connection to this unknown girl, this Patty Ramola, whose life was now spread out before him in this dusty hallway. Mr. Johnson knew he couldn't just keep the purse. It belonged to someone, or at least it had belonged to someone. He took the purse to the principal's office, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Mrs. Davis, the principal, a kind woman with a warm smile, listened intently as he recounted his discovery. Her eyes widened in surprise as she examined the contents of the purse. "This is incredible, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Absolutely incredible." The search began. They started with the Hoover High School ID. The school, thankfully, still existed, though it had moved to a new location. They contacted the school's archivist, a woman named Mrs. Peterson, who was initially skeptical but quickly became intrigued by the story. She delved into old yearbooks and student records, her fingers flying across the dusty pages. Days turned into a week. Mr. Johnson, fueled by a growing sense of purpose, spent his lunch breaks and evenings assisting Mrs. Peterson. They pored over old newspapers, contacted former teachers, and even tracked down a few alumni from Patty's graduating class. It was a painstaking process, filled with dead ends and frustrating silences. There were moments of hope, followed by crushing disappointments. One lead, a former classmate who remembered Patty vaguely, mentioned that she had married a man named Miller, or maybe Mitchell. It was a faint memory, decades old. They searched online databases, scouring obituaries and social media profiles, but found nothing conclusive. Then, a breakthrough. Mrs. Peterson, after hours of cross-referencing records, found a marriage certificate. Patricia Romola had married a man named Michael Carter. And sadly, they also found an obituary. Patricia Carter, née Romola, had passed away in 2013. A wave of sadness washed over Mr. Johnson. He had never met Patty, but he felt a profound sense of loss. He had become invested in her story, in her life. But the search wasn't over. The obituary mentioned surviving children. 3 of them. Mrs. Peterson, using online resources and public records, managed to track down their contact information. She made the call, her voice trembling slightly as she explained the situation to Patty's eldest daughter, Sarah. Sarah, along with her 2 brothers, David and John, agreed to meet Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Davis at North Canton Middle School. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday morning, in the very hallway where the purse had been found. The atmosphere was charged with emotion. Sarah, a woman in her late 50s, her eyes mirroring the same brightness as her mother's in the old photographs, clutched her hands together nervously. David and John, both somber and respectful, stood beside her. Mr. Johnson, feeling a lump in his throat, carefully placed the purse on a table. He recounted the story of its discovery, his voice filled with a quiet reverence. Sarah reached out, her fingers tracing the worn leather of the purse. Tears welled up in her eyes. "This is incredible," she whispered. "We had no idea." They opened the purse together. The same items that Mr. Johnson had carefully examined were now being held by Patty's children. The pencils, the calendar, the ticket stubs, the photographs. Each object sparked a memory, a story, a shared moment of grief and remembrance. "Mom always loved to dance," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion, as she held up a faded ticket stub. She used to tell us stories about the school dances. David picked up a photograph of Patty leaning against the car. "That was Dad's car," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "He used to say Mom was the most beautiful girl in the world." John, the youngest, carefully examined the YMCA membership card. "She always encouraged us to be active," he said. "She was a big believer in staying healthy." And then, they found the wheat pennies. 5 of them, nestled in a small, velvet pouch. Sarah gasped. "Mom used to collect these," she said. "She said they were lucky." In a gesture of profound significance, each of Patty's children took one of the wheat pennies, a tangible piece of their mother's past, a symbol of her enduring presence in their lives. The dusty red purse, once a forgotten relic hidden behind a locker, had become a vessel of time, a bridge across generations. It had brought together strangers, reunited a family with their lost mother, and reminded everyone present of the enduring power of memory and love. Mr. Johnson, the unassuming janitor, had inadvertently become the catalyst for this extraordinary reunion. He had simply been doing his job, fixing a broken locker. But in doing so, he had unearthed a story far greater than he could have ever imagined. A story of a young woman, a life lived, and a legacy that would continue to ripple through time. The small act of repairing had set off an unexpected and beautiful wave. In the quiet halls of North Canton Middle School, the echoes of laughter and shared memories lingered. The story of Patty Romola, the girl with the smiling eyes and the red purse, would be told and retold, a testament to the enduring human connection that transcends time and loss. And somewhere, perhaps, Patty was smiling, knowing that her story, like the wheat penny she cherished, would continue to bring a little bit of luck and a whole lot of love to those she left behind. The seemingly ordinary had become extraordinary.